Well, good morning, everybody, again. Good to see you all. I'm delighted that you can join us as we carry on our Addressing Anxiety series. Whether you're here on site or online, just delighted that you're part of our fellowship today. And it is a real joy to be back after the trip to the US. It's big, it's shiny, but there's no like coming home. So it's been great to reconnect again with us as a church here at Bridge Community. So this morning, I particularly want to think around this idea of addressing anxiety, some of the issues that cause the anxiety, what contributes to it, and how we can respond. We have during the week many things that perhaps can help us with our anxiety levels. You know, we have small groups, we have people who meet and signposting and different support areas. But also sometimes I think we need to dig a little bit deeper and ask the question, what is really causing some of our problems and how we can respond to it. And we started off the series just by looking at some of the statistics. In 2017, 16 million people in our country said they're struggling with their mental health and anxiety. 75% of that 16 million said it started in their teenage years and carried on into adulthood. So as we see these statistics, these are pre-COVID statistics. So you can imagine how much more they've spiked since then. All the stress of the lockdowns, the ill health, the relationship challenges we had during those COVID years. And we'll throw in a war in Europe, we'll throw in spiking petrol prices and utility bills and things like this. We see lots of things bombarding upon us that really get to us and cause us anxiety in our minds and in our hearts. But also we have to say, yeah, there's some outside stuff. But there is some inside stuff. And the question you can see today is, how have you fallen or failed this week? We have to be honest that sometimes our anxiety levels are not caused by things on the outside, they're caused by us. When we fail to even keep our own standards, we may say, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to live like this. And yet, within a day or two, we realize we've fallen short of those standards. We fail. Now, add to that a God factor. If we fail by our own standards, how much more do we fall and fail by God's standards? If you were to look at this week and say, how far have you fallen this week? And I have to confess, even though I'm stood up here preaching God's word, in my thoughts, I've failed to think godly thoughts at times this week. In my language, I've failed to say some things that were good and helpful. In my behavior, I could blame jet lag, but at times I think, oh, have I been as intentional as I should have been? Have I been a bit lazy? Have I been? You fill in the dots there. It doesn't matter who we are, where we are, we all seem to fall, and that can have a resulting impact on us thinking, oh, God won't like me anymore. God will give up on me. This was really powerful in my life because I grew up with an image of God that was incorrect. I grew up with God, an image of God that he was this big, nasty head teacher with a big stick, and every time I messed up, he was just looking to hit me. That was the view of God I grew up with. And I praise and thank God as I've read my Bible and interacted with more and more people. You see, actually, it's not that image at all. We've got a loving, caring Father who has intervened and stepped in to help us out. And it's that what I want to really talk about this morning. This change of position, this move from feeling downtrodden, being beaten by God into a place of being uplifted and encouraged. There's this God intervention as we think about our fall, our failure, our shortcomings. Can we transition our thoughts to God's view, God's perspective upon us? As we surrender our lives to God, as we give our lives to Jesus, as we just heard from our young people, as we do that, there is a radical change in position. There is a complete move from being in the anger of God to being in the comfort of God. And we want to unpack those things today. And in particular, I've identified three things from the passage that Ian read in Isaiah 12 to help us in this. First of all, we must trust, we must believe that God has done that transition work. This is the inner working within us that God has done this work. Secondly, we need to start to verbalize it. We still need to testify about it. We need to talk to God and others about it. Somehow, this thing that we believe internally has got to come out verbally. And again, as Ian's encouraged us today, somehow we've got to turn the volume up occasionally. We've got to be trumpeting. We've got to be loud. We've got to sing. We've got to shout about God's goodness. And as we do these three things, I believe there starts to be a help for our mental health and our anxiety levels as the truth about what God's done for us, that truth of that change in position starts to become owned and a reality for us. So to help us unpack these things, we're going to turn to the book of Isaiah in the Jewish part of the Bible, if you like, the Old Testament. And the book of Isaiah is an ancient collection of messages particularly directed at God's people at different times, different places, different periods of their history, many centuries before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. Some are prophetic, some are messages that are preached, some are messages that are written, but they're all contained in this quite big book we find in our Old Testament. And in particular today, as we look at Isaiah 12, it's set as a segue section around the 8th century BC. At this point, Israel, Judah, things are good. Things are good. They haven't been invaded by anybody. There's no big threat of a Babylonia or Syria coming to get them. Things are good. And so this is the view God starts to challenge the people of God on in Isaiah 1 to 11. He says, yeah, you're super religious. You're doing this stuff. You're turning up to the equivalent of church. You're praying. You're tithing. You're connecting with God's word and God's people. So on the surface, it all looks good. But as you dig down in those chapters, you start to see various comments where God says, despite your religious practices, I'm seeing a proud people. I'm seeing a people who are arrogant. I'm seeing a people who are overfed. I see a people who are adding to the rich-poor divide. I'm seeing a people who don't care for other people. I'm seeing a people who, unfortunately, are not that interested in those who are poor, oppressed, the orphan, the widow, the alien. And God starts to express concerns about this. And it's such a harsh judgment, he likens them to the leaders of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, whatever anybody says about you, one thing you never want in your life is to be likened to Sodom and Gomorrah. Because these were two cities that were wiped off the face of the earth. You never want to be in that position, yet this is God's view on his people back at this time period. And he says, do you know what? Drought is coming your way. Judgment's coming your way. Invasion, destruction, and ruin is coming your way unless you change your behavior. You move beyond the religiousness on a spiritual day and start to implement my practices right throughout the week. And you might be saying right now, David, I thought we were trying to address my anxiety. You're adding to my anxiety levels here. But the great thing is, God doesn't send a message of judgment without a message of hope. And historically, we know the people around the time and the period of King Hezekiah did respond to this message. And also, we just read Isaiah 12, where God talks about this change of position that we can enjoy. So what's this root out of anxiety? Well, we find in Isaiah 12, verse 1, the start of this process. It says, in that day you will say, I will praise you, Lord. Although you were angry with me, your anger has turned away and you have comforted me. So there is this transition. Do you see that there? There is a place of anger, and yet there's been a transition and a move to a place of comfort. There was a place of rejection, is now replaced with a place of acceptance. A place of exclusion is now replaced with a place of inclusion. Once enemy, now friend. This is all the picture and imagery around this verse. Suddenly, there is a safe place for people, fallen people, people who are getting it wrong. God is saying, do you know what? We can work this out and move you into a good, safe place. But what's the key to this? Well, we see it in those first three words. In that day. Something seems to have taken place that caused this transition. And we can find that by turning back a few pages into Isaiah chapter 11. Please spot the deliberate mistake there. It's not Isaiah 12, but Isaiah 11, 10 to 11, where Isaiah writes, "In that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious. In that day, the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the surviving remnants of his people from Assyria, and it starts to list many other countries like Babylon and Egypt, the various superpowers and empires of the day. So here we see this transition. Here we see God creating this new exodus of gathering people back to him. It's his work, his intervention, and it seems to be linked to this expression, the root of Jesse. And we think, well, what's that? Well, Jesse was the father of David, who became King David, who then was promised to by God, you will have someone who's going to reign and rule forever. And of course, out of that David line, we sing it at Christmas time, Jesus emerged. This is the God intervention. We haven't earned it, we haven't deserved it, but God stepped in time and history in order to bring this change of position from anger into comfort. And God is drawing his people from the nations in order to enjoy that. So this is the transformation we can enjoy if we've surrendered to God and to the Lord Jesus Christ. So we have to trust it. We have to believe it. And this is where we see in verses 2 and 3, where Isaiah says, surely God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. The Lord himself is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. So what do you do? What do you trust in order to bring you joy? It might be your bank account. It might be a promotion at work. It might be some of the relationships or family or some hobbies that bring you joy. And of course they do, temporarily. But there's no guarantee of that change of position like God has brought about. And God is looking for a lifestyle of trust. Not just when we're desperate, not when we're struggling, not when we haven't got the answers, but all the time. And I just love this expression, surely, certainly, God is my salvation. God is my rescue. This is a personal statement from the writer, that God will intervene. And what is the outcome of that? Or what is God looking for? That we trust and not afraid. As we grasp more and more of what God has done for us, hopefully our trust levels will increase, and that will start to have an impact on our mental health and anxiety levels. Some of the detail we'll see there, some of the intervention. The Lord himself is my strength, my defense. He is my joy. All these things are good. When you think those anxieties are beginning to attack us, God is our defense and our fortress. He can affect the way we think. He is our strength. When we fall and fail, he gives us the strength to get up and go again every day with him. And of course, he provides a source of joy. And I love this picture there at the end, drawing water from the wells of salvation. It's a daily drawing on what God is doing for us. I don't know about you. You might be fearful about the future. You might be wondering, how am I going to pay the bills? Can you see the sense of provision here? With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. This is not a well that's going to run out. This is not a well that's going to be like people in Chad have been suffering with, as we heard earlier before. This is a joy. This is a continual source of provision from God. So how can we trust more? Well, I'd encourage us to do some of the things we've been doing this morning. We've been reading scriptural truths about God. Let those truths impact our thinking. Let us sing those songs of truth again to affect our thinking. Let's repeat them. Let's do them daily in order that this truth can permeate our thinking and we can trust God more and more. And that can help us navigate some of those issues where we're afraid, concerned, or suffering anxiety. Let's move on. This internal belief has somehow got to be verbalized and talked about and testified about. So if I was to ask you the question today, what are you talking about? You've seen me earlier, I was talking a lot about my trip to America. It's all I seem to have done in this last week, talk about the big and the great in America. But actually, what is happening here is including God in this conversation. Instead of saying how great it was in America, what about the answers to prayer in order to see the greatness in America? What about the way God provided? What about the way God cared? These are the things I should be talking about. And this comes out in verse 4, as it's a community conversation. The first few verses were me and my relationship with God. Now it's a conversation with us. It says, in that day you will say, give praise to the Lord, proclaim his name, make known among the nations what he has done, and proclaim that his name is exalted. So there's this challenge to testify upward and outward. Do you see that? Give praise to God, but then tell the nations. So we've got to start verbalizing this. And as we verbalize things, it starts to impact the way we think and the way we handle our anxiety levels. We proclaim God's name, his reputation. As you read your Bibles, God has different names, and it unpacks different aspects of God's character that we can tap into. You think about Jesus, the bread of life, the door, the living water. All these various names give insights that we can enter into. You think about in the Old Testament, Jehovah Jireh, the great provider. These are qualities of God that bring peace of mind. Why? Because God is exalted. His name is exalted. He is a great big God, and he is bigger than any of your failure, any of your struggles, or any of your falls. There's this real transition. Instead of it being all about me and I'm such a loser and I get things wrong and I fail and I fall, and we start to talk about God a lot more. We talk to God about God. We talk to others about God, and that brings encouragement to us. The shift in perspective is so important. Having conversations about God rather than me and my failure is crucial if we're going to enjoy greater levels of mental health. We have a God of victory, a God who's changed our position, so let's talk about him, because that's the emphasis that is required. And lastly, not just talking, but let's shout and sing and declare, trumpet about the great things God has done. It says in verses 5 to 6, sing to the Lord, for he has done glorious things. Let this be known to all the world. Shout aloud, sing for joy, people of Zion, for great is the Holy One of Israel among you. So this quiet talking, one-to-one, is now becoming an explosion of noise. Actually, again, there's another change in the terms of the voices here. It started off with a masculine singular voice, this chapter. Then it turned into a community voice. Now it turns to a feminine singular voice, as basically the women of Jerusalem are called upon to declare the praise of God, to shout it out loud, to sing it. Again, very much part of the Exodus imagery, and Miriam declaring God's greatness and saving them. As I was reading this, an old hymn came to mind. Some of you may know it. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God has done. Do we do it? Do we just state that, oh yeah, God does glorious things, but do we take the time to name exactly the glorious things God is doing? Do we take the time to sing about it, to celebrate it, to shout about it? Because that is absolutely crucial to shape our thinking, a sense of mental well-being, as we declare how great and how good God is. It says, shout aloud and sing for joy. During my travels in the US with Lewis, there were some great moments. But I'm going to tell you, this 40-minute commute in our big car provided by this family for the week was precious. Proper dad and lad time together. So basically, I'm driving along, of course, automatic car, coffee, donuts, the full American experience. That's the way you do things in America. And Lewis, he's in charge of the tunes. He's in charge of the playlist. And I was pleasantly surprised. My son actually has decent taste in music. It was okay. And we did a real mixture of Christian and secular music. And you know what? We sang our hearts out. We had to apologize to a number of people in different villages as we went through. But the sound system in this car, this huge car, was so good. We were having our own rock concert. And it was brilliant. And you know what? The jet lag disappeared. The stresses, the intensity of things disappeared because we just sang our hearts out. We shouted. And particularly with the Christian songs, just declaring great truth. Me and my 15-year-old boy banging out these shouts of praise and adoration to God. It did us good. Build some time and space in your life to sing and shout to God. I know I talked about this last time I spoke, but again, just really reinforced it. And it really brought this connection between Lewis and I with God together. It was just precious, absolutely precious. And we have so much to celebrate. Shout aloud and sing for joy, people of Zion. What does that mean? Well, Zion is a city within a city. It's located to the southeast of Jerusalem on the hills there. And it's this impenetrable fortress palace that King David built. And over the years, it's become a picture of heaven. That once you enter this heaven, this palace, this fortress, this impenetrable thing, we are safe, we are secure. This is our position in God today. That's why we can sing. That's why we can shout, because our God is great and he's doing glorious things amongst us, as we've already testified today. Can I encourage you to grasp what you have in God? As I think of that Mount Zion, I may have mentioned this once or twice before, but I'm linked to royalty. Have I mentioned that once or twice before? When I did a little bit of our lockdown hobby was to review my ancestry. On my mum's side, wasn't so good, just a bunch of farmers in Cheshire and Wales and that kind of thing. But on my dad's side, we discovered this link to King Richard II. And the thing I noticed as I was going further and further back in the centuries was that constantly my dad's family were living in this castle in Shropshire for hundreds of years. And I kept thinking, before I discovered the link to royalty, they must maybe blacksmiths, maybe servants, maybe just doing something in this castle. But what it was because they were linked to royal blood. They were part of family, of royalty, so they could stay in the castle. Isn't that our position today in Christ? If you said yes to Jesus, you're royal blood. You can be part of this castle, this fortress, this palace in heaven. That is your position today. Failure is irrelevant in that respect. Your position is you're in the palace and fortress of heaven. That is family because of what God has done. Let that encourage you. Sing and shout about this stuff. So in conclusion, let's find some space to shout and sing. It's God, and we've got to do some rearranging of our schedules and our diaries here somehow to get that space to sing and celebrate. Is that something God has been saying to you today? Is that your action point? Or maybe there is someone we need to tell about the good news of Jesus. Ian was encouraging us. Let's share the answered prayers. Let's not keep them to ourselves. Let's tell people that God is answering prayers. This is part of our challenge, or my challenge for this coming month of July. A number of you know that we're trying to get some learning and some training on how to do discipleship better in our church. And we've been working with a number of other churches, and there's 6 of us going through this year-long training course in 2022. And the pastor who was working with us last week, he said, do you know what? The devotional stuff is going well. Your conversations with each other is going well. What we need now is that outward impact. So he's challenged us in the month of July, start talking to people outside of church. Start sharing some good news about what God is doing with people outside the church. He's given us a deadline for the end of July. So I've written in my diary, I've got to start connecting and talking with people outside of church. Somehow this good stuff has got to break out beyond West Road site. People out there need to know what a great and glorious God we've got. And lastly, are we actually trusting and believing that God is big enough to deal with our falls? Maybe you've been a Christian many years and you're struggling with this. I've done this so many times. I've failed. I get this thing wrong. God can't love me. God can't accept me. Well, he can, because he is your loving Father. And maybe there's some here who, as yet, have not responded to this. And really, what I want to do now before we turn to communion is read a little story. Uncle David's going to read you a story. That's nice. You're sitting comfortably. Don't fall asleep, but we're going to do this. This is a book by Phil Knox. He works for the Evangelical Alliance, and it's called Story Bearer. And he tells this great story about himself, Phil, his wife Danny, and his little 3-year-old Caleb. So I hope you're sitting comfortably. I'm going to read you this story. Phil says this: "My son shares many attributes with me. Genetics are a terrifying thing. My son's easily excitable, awake far too easily in the morning, seriously competitive, and always hungry. The two of us fight every day to just get through to the next meal without some serious snacking. But the impatience for food led my 3-year-old Caleb to approach his mum in the kitchen one morning and announced that he wanted a snack. Danny, my wife, used to this kind of request, calmly informed Caleb that it was only 11:30 in the morning. Lunchtime is not till 12:15. She should have remembered at this point that the foolishness of negotiating with terrorists or toddlers. Caleb, in a state of hanger, which is when hunger meets anger, spies one of Dad's espresso coffee mugs on the kitchen surface and reaches for it. With a white porcelain mini mug in hand, he turns to his mum in a newfound assertiveness, bursting through his veins, raises his arms to their sides, and like a hooligan goading the police, puffs out his chest in defiance, looks at the mug, looks at Danny, his mum, and says, 'No, I want a snack.' Danny keeps her counsel, shows extreme bravery by not being intimidated by this 3-year-old crockery-wielding maniac in front of her, and takes a step forward and says, 'Caleb, I have told you it is not yet lunchtime. There is to be no snack, and I hope you're not about to do what I think you're going to do.' Caleb, though, adrenaline coursing through his body, looks again at the cup and again at his mum, and then back at the cup before dashing it to the ground, almost certainly feeling like this is the killer blow of the argument. This is the sucker punch. Victory is here. If breaking Daddy's coffee mug doesn't get him a snack, then nothing else will. He stands over the wreckage with the pride of a lion over its prey, like a fighter over his defeated adversary, and declares to his mum, 'Snack now.' Of course, it's fair to say that his mum's response was not quite what he expected. Like his dad, he doesn't like being told off, and even less impressed with 5 minutes on the naughty step. At this point, I enter the action stage and wonder what has taken place, with my beloved coffee cup splattered all over the floor, and a shell-shocked wife and a son screaming like a banshee in the background. Danny tells me what's happened, and so I go to Caleb. His cheeks are hot and red, tears streaming down his face, and he's repeating over and over, 'I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry.' But curiously, he will not look at me. His face ashamedly turned to one side. To me, the coffee cup is really not the big deal. What really mattered to me was to be reconciled with my boy. So I gently took his face, turned it towards mine. As the crying died down, I looked at my precious son in the eyes and said, 'Caleb, I love you. Caleb, I forgive you. Caleb, it's going to be okay.' Caleb responded, 'Daddy, I want to come back home.' The world is full of broken coffee cups. We only have to look as far as our own hearts to see that all is not well. But the offensive, comforting, outrageous, beautiful, scandalous, astonishing message of God's story is that he has the power to gently turn our face towards him, look into the depths of our souls and say, 'I love you, I forgive you, and it's going to be okay.' All we have to do is come to our senses and come back home to God." just in the quiet, perhaps bow our heads, close our eyes before we turn to communion. Let's take that step to come back to God. Whatever failure, whatever fall, whatever struggle we've had this week, we've got a God who loves us, a God who forgives us, a God who longs to make his face shine upon us if we'll only turn our face towards him and receive from him. Will you take that step and come home today to God?